The Emperor Elagabalus ruled the Roman Empire for 4 years, and yet this was long enough for him to change the fate of the world forever. Many of you will have sought out this podcast because you've heard some intriguing rumor suggesting to you that there was a transgender emperor of Rome. There can be no doubt that in the 21st century, Elagabalus is remembered because of his sex life. In the years following immediately after his death, there can be no doubt that everyone wanted to forget him because of his sex life. His name was chiseled off of monuments. Just try to picture this. Workmen being sent with chisels and hammers to scrape away the name of the former emperor from inscriptions in stone.
You are listening to Doomed Republic, a podcast about ancient ideals, modern utopias, dystopias, and attempts at democracy. My name is Eisel Mazard. You can call me Zell.
Here's the opening of the chapter in the Historia Augusta on this topic. Quote, "The life of Elagabalus Antoninus, also called Varius, I never would have put in writing, hoping that it might not be known that he was Emperor of the Romans, if, before him, this same imperial office had not had a Caligula, a Nero, a Vitellius." That very first sentence, he wishes he didn't have to write this chapter at all. He wishes he could suppress the historical memory of what happened. Right? There's a very, very important bias here. There's a very important kind of sentimentality that doesn't just vitiate the primary sources. It also vitiates the modern 20th and 21st century scholars who are interpreting, and in some cases ignoring, the evidence in front of them. Quote, "At the same time, in reading this history, you will learn of the good judgment of the Romans, since these emperors ruled for a long time and died by natural deaths, whereas the former were murdered, dragged through the streets, and branded as tyrants, and no man wishes to even mention their names." Close quote. So in this one paragraph, so to speak, I'm imposing modern concepts like sentence and paragraph onto the text, but leaving that anachronism aside, we begin with the author telling us that this chapter of history would be better off being left unwritten and forgotten. And the paragraph closes by praising the wisdom of the Roman people for assassinating Elagabalus and for assassinating other bad men like him. Okay, make no mistake, this is far more Machiavellian than Machiavelli. We are being told bluntly that the good judgment and wisdom of the Roman people is proven by their willingness to kill their own leaders whenever they deem it necessary. I'll read to you now from Herodian. Quote, "Even though the emperor seemed to be devoting all his attention to dancing and to his priestly duties, still he found time to execute many famous and wealthy men who were charged with ridiculing and censuring his way of life. He married one of the noblest of the Roman ladies and proclaimed her Augusta. But he soon divorced her, and, after depriving her of the imperial orders, he ordered her to return to private life. So that he might seem to be doing something manly, he made love to one of the Vestal virgins of Rome, priestesses who are bound by sacred vows to be chaste and to remain virgin to the end of their lives. Taking the maiden away from Vesta and the Holy Virgin's quarters, he made her his wife. he sent a letter to the Senate asking to be forgiven his impious and adolescent transgression, telling them that he was afflicted with a masculine failing and overwhelming passion for the maiden. He also informed them that the marriage of a priest and a priestess was both proper and sanctioned. But a short time later, he divorced this girl and took yet a third wife, a girl who belonged to the family of Commodus. This, I wish to contrast a single sentence quoted from the Historia Augusta, quote, "He never had intercourse with the same woman twice, except for his wife." I'm quoting this so early in the podcast to call into question the interpretation of this man as transgender. Now, whatever he felt in his innermost heart of hearts, this is presenting you the narrative of someone who was simultaneously trying to be the most masculine and the most feminine man in Rome. It wasn't just one or the other. This is indicating that he had rather competitive instincts, you might say, when it came to presenting himself as man enough for the job. We can put it that way. Now, we'll contrast this to what's probably the single most contentious passage of the extant record. This is from Cassius Dio. You'll hear more about the interpretive contest between these sources. Quote, "He carried his lewdness to such a point that he asked physicians to contrive a woman's vagina in his body by means of an incision, promising them large sums for doing so. Elagabalus himself was destined not much later to receive a well-deserved reward for his debauchery, for in consequence of doing and submitting to these things, he became hated by the populace and by the soldiers, to whom he was most attached, and at last he was slain by them in that very camp." So we now have a strange change in voice, and this reflects the extent to which these passages of Cassius Dio's history are pieced together from fragments, some of them not written by Cassius Dio's own pen. The Emperor Elagabalus, according to Dio, besought his physician to employ his skill to make him bisexual by means of an interior incision. So yes, quite a different phrasing from what I read to you earlier, that, quote, "he asked physicians to contrive a woman's vagina in his body by means of a surgical incision." Close quote. I continue, quote, "The false Antoninus was despised and put out of the way by the soldiers. Thus it is that persons, particularly if armed, when they have once accustomed themselves to feel contempt for their rulers, set no limit to their right to do what they please, but keep their arms ready to use against the very man who gave them that power."
The title of this episode is Elagabalus and the Religion of Rome, Emperor, Empress, Priest, and Priestess. This is an episode of a podcast called Doomed Republic, but Doomed Republic itself is part of a series of podcasts called Active Research and Informed Opinion. If you look at the written description, you'll find that it has a number in a sequence, AR plus IO.
During my short life, I have seen the rise and fall of ancient authors in our modern estimation of their value. You know, when I was in university, around the year 1998, it was remarkable to me how contemptuous and dismissive scholarly consensus was towards the writing of Suetonius. So Suetonius, one of the most famous, one of the most important historians of ancient Rome, and his style of writing, it's basically short biographies of each of the major emperors within that period. Suetonius, I was told, was not to be taken seriously. This is all just rumor and gossip. This isn't real history, this sort of thing. Well, a few decades go by and a few scholars step forward and decide to defend the reputation of this ancient author. I think a new generation of English translations is published. And to some extent, these wars are fought separately within the French language scholarship, within the German language scholarship, within the Spanish language scholarship. A great comparison, actually, Seneca. Seneca is always adored by the Spanish. The Spanish always have a very high opinion of Seneca. But in the English-speaking world, how valuable Seneca is changes in our estimation. So in this same way, the history of what happened and why it mattered with Elagabalus has been a bit of a victim. It's been, what would be the word? There has been a great deal of collateral damage done to the understanding of the history of Elagabalus by the contest between the three most important written sources we have about, very simply, what happened and why. Quote, modern assessments of Herodian's success as an author, as an historian, have varied. But at the present time, there is almost a consensus in the condemnation of this historian. Close quote. I'm quoting a man named Glenn Bowersock. His name is also given as G.W. Bowersock, born in 1936. And of all the sources I'm quoting today, this is probably the most expensive and the most obscure for you to get your hands on. This may be the single most expensive podcast I've ever recorded, more expensive than any of the YouTube videos I have recorded just from the books I purchased. Books I'll get to keep after this podcast is done. Nevertheless, it's been rather expensive, the reading I've done to put this information together. Quote, the denigration of the author we're talking about here, Herodian, the denigration has acquired the strength and majesty of a chorus, and it has encouraged scholars to dismiss the testimony of Herodian with minimal reflection. Skipping ahead here, several sentences, continue, quote, no reasonable person, on the evidence now available, will argue that Herodian is an historian of any great merit. Nor will it be denied that in general, Dio's narrative, where it overlaps with Herodian's, is the more trustworthy. But the two sources do not maintain a constant level of quality, and generalizations which apply to their accounts of one stretch of history are not necessarily applicable to their accounts of others. Herodian's merits, such as they are, become conspicuous in his narrative of a period which some critics have tended to avoid, the reign of Elagabalus. Dio's treatment of the period is not one of the better portions of his work, and has accordingly been neglected. Barnes calls Dio's account, quote, a violent and hysterical diatribe, unquote, and Miller dismissed it clearly with the words, quote, little of this calls for comment, unquote. I skip ahead just a few sentences here. In an article of major importance, Barnes has shown how to do it by examining the life of the emperor in the Historia Augusta. So I've already read you several quotations from that source. He has demonstrated that in this vita, far from being, quote, a farrago of cheap pornography, we find a high degree of accuracy in factual reporting. This is the end of my quotation from this source. I have to admit, it has been so long since I saw the word farrago. Farrago? Do you pronounce it farrago? No, I think farrago. Condemning and dismissing the Historia Augusta as nothing but a farrago of cheap pornography. This shows you how uncomfortable the interpreters are with what it is they have to interpret. Now, some of you might leap to the conclusion that they are uncomfortable with it for sexual reasons. They are uncomfortable reading the shocking facts of the sex life of Elagabalus. I actually think what they're uncomfortable with instead is the religious question raised by the life of Elagabalus. It profoundly erodes the sense of specialness of the Christian narrative. To a significant extent, it even erodes the sense of specialness in the Jewish narrative in the whole history of Europe. It makes us really reframe, reconsider, re-examine most fundamental assumptions about rise and fall of these religions in these centuries. It makes the story of Christianity seem like one among many. And it makes the story of Christianity seem more derivative than ever before. And that is very, very hard for true believing Christians to deal with. And I would say it's hard even for people with PhDs devoted their lives to the study of ancient Latin, who may be more brainwashed by Christianity than they are quite aware of themselves. So some of you want to seek out this article. It is titled Herodian and Elagabalus by Glenn Bowersock. I will just warn you, it begins on page 229 of this volume, and it ends on page 236. It's a very, very brief article, but it does set out for you some detailed examples of instances in which we know Herodian is telling the truth. Herodian is giving us accurate factual history, and Cassius Dio is not. And in some cases, even more shockingly, the anonymous author of the Historia Augusta is clearly giving us accurate factual history, whereas Cassius Dio is not. So this is a challenge to the interpreter's bias on this matter. The account of Cassius Dio is biased and sentimentally laden in a way that's difficult to summarize. Cassius Dio was alive when these events unfolded, and the emperor who succeeded after Elagabalus, so this is already mentioned, the adoptive son of Elagabalus, who became the next emperor thereafter, is Cassius Dio's employer. Cassius Dio directly tells us that the next emperor after Elagabalus does great honor to him and puts him in the highest possible positions of power and privilege in Rome. And so far as we know, that is the end of Cassius Dio's life. So he is writing as an old man. When he was writing this manuscript, he didn't know how many more years he had to live. Perhaps he was hoping to go back and write more about Elagabalus or about the events after the death of Elagabalus. But he has a very clear conflict of interest, so to speak. And I think if you just read the text carefully, you can feel the author's heartbreaking. He is obviously not comfortable criticizing the man who was his employer, quite possibly at the very moment he's holding the pen. Again, please forgive the anachronism. It would not have literally been a pen. He would not have been writing with a pen, but in any case, quite possibly while he was writing, he was employed by this emperor, or he was writing very soon after this period of employment, honor, distinction, power, and influence had ended. Cassius Dio, as was also mentioned very briefly before, he was out of town for the entire rule of Elagabalus. Perhaps that's why he survived the rule of Elagabalus. He returns to Rome after being in the foreign service on behalf of the Roman Empire for several years. And then he is writing about Elagabalus, what he hears after he returns, and quite possibly what he's hearing is propaganda on behalf of the new emperor, the new regime that has replaced Elagabalus. Cassius Dio is frankly overwhelmed with contradictory emotions in writing that part of the book. And simply engaging in a careful reading of the text, I really feel the closeness of his own death, that he is writing as if these may be the last few pages he writes, as if certainly this is the last chapter of the history of the Roman Empire he's going to write. Is this terrible, regrettable disaster the period of Elagabalus ruling Rome? And as everyone complains about Cassius Dio, his work concludes without any kind of political theory, without any kind of philosophy, Certainly, it ends without saying anything positive about democracy, which, a 21st century reader might be looking for in vain. There's nothing about democracy. There's nothing about ending slavery. There's nothing about peace or freedom or how to better structure a government of the empire. Today, scholars are squabbling with one another about the extent to which Cassius Dio was for or against monarchy in principle. Did he actually think it was a good thing that the role of democracy in the Roman Empire withered away? They went from being a republic, a mixed republic that had some role for democracy, to increasingly resembling a monarchy with a Senate. Or was he someone who supported the Senate, or was he someone who supported a return to the virtues of the more ancient Republican period? Right? You know what the simplest answer is? Cassius Dio, as an old man in the last months before he dies, he still hasn't made up his mind. Maybe he still has a broken heart about precisely these issues. And that's why he is so incoherent where it counts, including that he gives us a totally incoherent biography of Elagabalus, and it is an unbalanced, one-sided condemnation of Elagabalus. Quote you passage of text now from Cassius Dio. This was the author just a few decades ago all of the scholars want to regard as the most definitive, most influential, most reliable historical source. I have already suggested to you that I do not share this assumption. Not at all. When Bassianus was performing his priestly duties, dancing about the altars in barbarian fashion, the natives and the soldiers watched him with more than ordinary curiosity, aware that he belonged to the imperial family. His youthful beauty attracted the eyes of all. At that time, a huge army was quartered at Emesa. The soldiers were therefore frequent visitors in the city, and went to the temple on the pretext of worshipping the god, Elagabalus, but there they delighted in watching Bassianus. So if you hadn't guessed, Bassianus will later have a change of name and come to be known as the Emperor Elagabalus. At least in retrospect, that's what we now call him. While they stood admiring the youth, Maesa, either inventing the story or telling the truth, informed them that Bassianus was really the son of Caracalla. Caracalla, the former emperor. Although it might appear that he had another father, she claimed that when she was living in the palace with her sister, Caracalla supped with both of her daughters, who were then young and beautiful. The men repeated her story to their fellow soldiers, and it soon became common knowledge throughout the army. Maesa was rumored to be enormously wealthy, and it was reported that she would immediately give all her money to the soldiers if they restored the empire to her family. The soldiers agreed that if the family would come secretly to the camp at night, they would open the gates and receive the family inside, and proclaim Bassianus emperor and the son of Caracalla. The old woman agreed to the plan, preferring to risk any danger than live in obscurity and appear to have been discarded. Close quote. This is the first instance we have of a sort of fictional adoption story of this sort. Unless perhaps you would include the story of Moses, right? Moses allegedly is the long-lost son of royalty within Egypt. He's a baby who's put into a basket and discovered, and so allegedly, yes. Well, you tell me if this is more or less plausible that out in far-off Syria, where there's a somewhat bored army, a bored army that enjoys watching Bassianus, as he's then known. Quite possibly, by the way, he's only called Bassianus in retrospect, and he didn't have that name at that time. That's really another story. But whether or not he even had that name at that point, we don't know. But watching this teenage boy performing exotic rituals, singing and dancing, and they are told, this boy, maybe 14 years old at this point, maybe still 13, that this boy is the secret son of their emperor who so recently died, who so recently was assassinated at the hands of the current emperor, who will not live long. All right, I'll continue for just one more paragraph here, quoting Cassius Dio, a source that, again, you have to read with a great deal of skepticism. Quote, "And the rumor quickly spread through the rest of the armies that the son of Caracalla had been found, and that the sister of Julia was handing out money. Believing everything that was said and accepting it as true, the soldiers were deeply stirred. They were moved by the hatred of Macrinus." So, Macrinus is the current emperor who murdered the former emperor. "They were moved by hatred of Macrinus and pity for the memory of Caracalla. These considerations persuaded them to support a change of emperors. More than any other factor, however, the hope of money influenced their decision, and many soldiers voluntarily deserted to the new Caracalla." Again, this has influenced everything in our civilization forever after. But just the idea that a scheme like this can be put together, and one sort of false adoption begins another, because Elagabalus, he then goes on to adopt his own cousin as his successor, and then anyway, he is murdered and his cousin takes over. So it's a vicious cycle of adoption. Fictitious adoption, what can I tell you? Anyway, and fictitious claims to bloodline relations also, of course. Anyway, contemptuously dismissing the affair as the efforts of children and displaying his usual indolence, the current emperor, Macrinus, remained at home. But he did send one of the praetorian prefects to Emesa with a contingent of troops which he considered large enough to crush the rebels with the greatest of ease. When the prefect, Julianus, arrived and attacked the walls of the camp, the soldiers inside got up on the towers and battlements and displayed Bassianus to the besieging army. Cheering the son of Caracalla, they waved their full purses to induce the attackers to desert. Believing that Bassianus was the son of Caracalla, and believing that he looked exactly like him, for this is what they wanted to see, the besieging soldiers cut off Julianus's head and sent it back to the Emperor Macrinus. When the gates were opened, all of them were welcomed into their camp. I love the inclusion of the phrase, "for this is what they wanted to see." This narrative account several times over cautions us that people are seeing what it is they want to see. The mother of Elagabalus is the first woman to sit in the Senate in Rome. She is the first woman to speak and be heard and participate in, I guess, what we would now call the legislative process, the deliberative process. She is admitted to the Senate and participates in a way that no woman ever did before. And as that narrative just told you, Elagabalus's mother and grandmother are really the people of crucial importance in creating this regime. And it's the same grandmother who controls the next emperor after Elagabalus, his cousin. I quote now from the Historia Augusta. "He also established a senaculum, or women's senate, on the Quirinal Hill. Before this time, a congress of matrons had met there, but only on certain festivals." Skipping over a few sentences. The point being that his mother and grandmother actually set up a women's senate. This account, whether it is biased or unbiased, reproaches the women's senate for being preoccupied with trivialities. So I'll continue. Quote, "Absurd decrees were enacted concerning rules to be applied to matrons, what kinds of clothing each might wear in public, who was to yield precedence and to whom, who was to advance a kiss to another, who might ride in a chariot, who on a horse, who on a pack animal, who on an ass, who might be driven in a carriage drawn by mules or one drawn by oxen." ... I close the quote here. So our historian is not very pleased with the use that these women made of the measure of political power granted to them. That's not my point in drawing attention to this aspect of the reign of Elagabalus. And of course, it comes to a dramatic end. Quote, "His mother was killed with him, a most depraved woman and deserving of such a son. And the first measure enacted after the death of Elagabalus provided that no woman should ever enter the Senate again, and that the life of anyone who allowed a woman to enter should be declared doomed and forfeited to the kingdom of the dead." So this experiment in allowing women to participate in the men's Senate, the real Senate that had real power, we don't know if it was just his mother and grandmother or if there were any other women he brought into the Senate, but at any rate, having at least one woman or a few women come into the Senate and be able to speak and so on, and of setting up a parallel women's Senate, this totally discredited the concept of women's equal or even unequal participation in politics. So despicable was the regime of Elagabalus that they decided to prevent this from ever happening again. Taking a step backwards in the same text, the life of Caracalla is only a few pages earlier in the same source, the Historia Augusta. Quote, "He brought the cult of Isis to Rome and built magnificent temples everywhere, celebrating her rites with greater reverence than they had ever been celebrated before. It is amazing to me, however, how can it be said that he was the first to bring the rites of Isis to Rome, for Antoninus Commodus had celebrated them too, and he even carried about the statue of Anubis with all the ritualistic pauses. Perhaps, however, Bassianus, meaning the Emperor Caracalla, merely added to the renown of the goddess, and was not actually the first to bring her to Rome." At the time that Caracalla lived, the religion of Isis was more than 2,000 years old. So we are discussing a period of ancient history in Rome. We're talking about very roughly the year 200 AD. The death of Elagabalus is 222 AD. We're talking about events in around this period of time. In the same sense that today, the year 1 seems like an impossibly long time ago. It just seems very difficult to imagine how different the world was 2,000 years ago, the period of the genesis of the Jesus myth, if you want to put this. When the Emperor Caracalla was alive, when the Emperor Elagabalus was alive, the origin of the religion of Isis would have seemed unbelievably ancient and remote in time. Now, I don't know precisely how many years earlier it was. A few of you will be shouting out it was much more than 2,000 years. I agree. Was it perhaps 2,600 years before life of Caracalla? Was it even 2,800 years? We don't know. It's certainly a topic for another podcast. Conjectural theories about just how ancient the religion of Isis and Osiris might be. My point is to say that if you situate yourself in the context of ancient Rome, they were looking back to religions in Egypt, in Syria, in the area we now call Israel, that were far, far more ancient and mysterious. Now, our author here, the author of the Historia Augusta, is reflecting on how absurd it seems to give Caracalla credit as the first emperor to introduce the religion of Isis to Rome. But evidently, people were saying this at the time because he greatly expanded the popularity of the religion of Isis in Rome. And if you do not know, Isis, Osiris, Anubis, these are Egyptian traditions. Well, I count 3 earlier occasions on which the Emperor of Rome chose to close down the temples worshiping Isis, to cast out the statues, the religion, to suppress or expel the cult of Isis in Rome. The middle of these 3 is when the Emperor Octavian is at war with Cleopatra in Egypt. And these examples of the religion of Isis being suppressed, temporarily banned in downtown Rome, put it that way, but being tolerated in the suburbs, and it's not really as serious as the Spanish Inquisition, and many centuries later. It's not anything comparable to the way Islam would actually exterminate rival religions, or Christianity did for the long centuries of the Dark Ages. But nevertheless, the push and pull of the government of Rome against this kind of ancient Semitic religion, becoming more and more popular in Rome, it shows the extent to which Rome, during these centuries, really did have a kind of gradually unfolding religious identity crisis. And that's a crisis that would conclude with mass conversion to Christianity. But Christianity was neither the first nor the last exotic Eastern religion that would, so to speak, catch fire in Rome. Now, again, if this isn't already clear to you, the fact that Octavian, the Emperor Octavian, carried out a campaign to close down, suppress, and expel temples worshiping Isis, that is evidence, first and foremost, that these were popular enough, these were important enough to be suppressed. Right? The religious tradition existed, it had followers, it had adherents. And as I've just noted, Caracalla, the hypothetical father of Elagabalus, he brought the worship of this Egyptian goddess, Isis, to newfound levels of prominence and popularity. One more very short quotation from the life of Caracalla I want to read you before we move on to Elagabalus. Quote, "Once, when he was 7 years old, hearing that a certain playmate of his had been severely beaten for adopting the Jewish religion, he refused for a long time to look at either the boy's father or his own, because he regarded them as responsible for the beating." Close quote. So this would have been the year 195 AD. And some members of the wealthy elite in Rome find Judaism charismatic enough a religion, intriguing enough a religion, interesting enough a religion to convert to. This is obviously hinting at a complex family situation in which a son is converting to Judaism, converting from Roman paganism, the polytheistic religion that's difficult to summarize, and then his father is preventing him, or is at least punishing him, for having done so. I turn now to the life of Elagabalus, just a few pages later in the same text, really. As soon as he entered the city, however, neglecting the affairs of the provinces, he established Elagabalus as a god on the Palatine Hill, close to the imperial palace, and he built him a temple, with the intention of transferring to it the statue of the Great Mother, the fire of Vesta, the Palladium, the shields of the Salii, and all that the Romans held sacred, intending that no god be worshipped at Rome except Elagabalus. He declared furthermore that the religions of the Jews and the Samaritans and the rites of the Christians must also be transferred to this place, in order that the priesthood of Elagabalus might include the mysteries of every form of worship. The implicit significance here of the existence of and the competition between Judaism, Christianity, the old religion that we call paganism, and then the religion of Elagabalus himself, which you'll learn more about in this podcast, attempting to unify these into one tradition with one temple. Now, what could be more significant for understanding the end of paganism in the Roman Empire, and thus the end of paganism in all of Europe, and the rise of Christendom, the transition from the Roman Empire to the Dark Ages, so on and so forth? What could possibly be of greater importance than this very period of 4 years. 4 years coming so soon after, as we've just narrated at great length, the earlier Emperor Caracalla had made an Egyptian form of religion popular in Rome. Now, this is a different Semitic religion, a Syrian religion, that to all the evidence we have is basically identical to First Temple Judaism, identical in all but name, and not so surprising because this is coming from a group of Semitic people from right next door in Syria. Now, we regard the map of this part of the world today as divided with insuperable lines. Lines on a map guarded by men with guns who will shoot you if you dare to step over them. However, as I'm recording this, there is war in Homs, Syria. There is war in Aleppo, Syria. Just within the last few days, armies have marched over and occupied Aleppo. They've moved a border within Syria and the Syrian civil war. So yes, it's somewhat stirring to read about this period around the year 200 AD, when men and women would walk from Syria to Rome. When Homs was an important place in the Roman Empire in its own right, it's where Elagabalus himself came from. And when people could indeed walk, whether that was with a donkey beside them or a slowly rolling wooden cart, they could walk across what's now Syria, across what's now the westernmost corner of Turkey, and into the core of the Roman Empire. And that is really what Elagabalus did, although reportedly he had a very fancy chariot, very fancy donkeys and horses. Nevertheless, that would have been the slow grinding pace of his transition when he took over power. Again, you'll hear a little bit more about that as this podcast goes on. Now, in the passage I read you just a moment ago, you may have been confused to hear Elagabalus being referred to as both the emperor and the god. It is slightly insulting for these historians to refer to the emperor as the Emperor Elagabalus. This, in effect, means he is the emperor who was remembered for establishing the religion of Elagabalus in Rome. Really, Elagabalus is the name of the god or the religion. It is not, properly speaking, the name of the man. But it is the name that has become popular. Many of the emperors of Rome are remembered and referred to with nicknames, and in many cases the nicknames are in fact insulting. To deal with last things first here, the death of Elagabalus according to the Historia Augusta. Next, the soldiers fell upon Elagabalus himself and killed him in a latrine where he had taken refuge. Then his body was dragged through the streets, and the soldiers further insulted it by thrusting it into a sewer. But since the sewer happened to be too small to admit the corpse, they attached a weight to it to keep it from floating and hurled it from the Aemilian bridge into the Tiber in order that it might never be buried. The body was also dragged around the circus before it was thrown into the Tiber. His name, that is to say, the name Antoninus, was erased from the public records by order of the Senate, although the name Varius Elagabalus was left, for he had used the name Antoninus without valid claim, wishing to be seen as the son of Antoninus, and he was the only one of all the emperors whose body was dragged through the streets, thrust into the sewer, and hurled into the Tiber. And this gives us the sense of, in the end, how he is to be remembered and how he is to be forgotten. Now, why? Ancient Greece and ancient Rome alike are notorious for their tolerance of pedophilia, their tolerance of pederasty, their tolerance of many different forms of homosexuality that can include something closely resembling transgenderism, cross-dressing, so on and so forth. The Emperor Nero, long before Elagabalus, was married to a man. In fact, he had 2 gay weddings. The Emperor Nero had one wedding in which he played the part of a man being married to a transgender woman, so to speak. And he had another wedding in which he played the part of the woman. He was the bride being married to a man. So from our perspective, those were 2 gay marriages that the Emperor Nero had. And Nero was popular. He was popular and supported by the people. Even after his death, he continues to be popular. And in the civil war for who is going to succeed him, who is going to take over after, all of the people who are proposing that they should be the next emperor, they are exaggerating the extent to which they closely resemble and will closely continue the legacy of Nero. They are calling themselves the next Nero, the new Nero, so on and so forth, for the approval of the public. All of this evidence suggests that Nero was broadly popular with the people, so to speak, and again, continued to be popular even after his death. If he had been unpopular or despised, then these men who were not exactly running for election, but these men who were seeking public support for their candidacy to be the next emperor, they would have emphasized the extent to which what they would do would be utterly different from what had come before in the reign of Nero. So the case study of Elagabalus, is it in effect a study of the limits of tolerance? That the tolerance for homosexuality and forms of sex that today we would call pedophilia, that the tolerance for transgenderism, transvestitism, so on and so forth, that had a limit. And that Nero was not over the limit, but that when we look at Elagabalus, we're looking at someone who went beyond the limits of that culture of tolerance. Is that why his body is thrown in a sewer, he's dragged through the streets, and his name is erased from the walls? Is that where, in effect, we should be looking? Cassius Dio writes, "The offense consisted not in his introducing a foreign god into Rome, or in his exalting him in very strange ways, but in his placing him even before Jupiter himself, and causing himself to be voted his priest. Also in his circumcising himself and abstaining from swine's flesh, on the ground that his devotion would thereby be purer. He had planned, indeed, to cut off his genitals altogether, but that desire was prompted solely by his effeminacy. The circumcision, which he actually carried out, was instead a part of the priestly requirements of the god Elagabalus, and accordingly he mutilated many of his companions in like manner." Pause. The resemblance to First Temple Judaism is difficult to exaggerate. There are also resemblances to the earliest forms of Islam, Arabic religion, resemblance seen throughout the early Semitic religions. But yes, you did hear that correctly. This was a religion that refused to eat pork, like Judaism, refused to have anything to do with pigs, that practiced male circumcision, and that believed in a hereditary priestly caste who spent a great deal of their time sacrificing animals on altars for this god. At a minimum, you have to say, during this regime lasting 4 years, would have felt like a long time if you had been in Rome living through it, you had a very strange rehearsal for the rise of Christianity that would follow soon after, and in a sense, the rise of Judaism that was ongoing throughout the Roman Empire at that time. Quote, "He was bestowed in marriage and was termed wife, mistress, and queen. He worked with wool, sometimes wore a hairnet, and painted his eyes, daubing them with white lead and alkanet. Once, indeed, he shaved his chin and held a festival to mark the event, but after that he had the hairs plucked out so to look more like a woman. And he often reclined while receiving the salutations of senators. The husband of this quote-unquote woman was Hierocles, a Carian slave." Just pause. A little bit difficult to follow this passage. I do think the significance of saying he worked with wool, sometimes wore a hairnet and painted his eyes. I would assume what's being suggested here is that he used wool padding. So he stuffed his bra, so to speak, with wool, this sort of thing. I assume that's the point of that. Painting his eyes with white lead and red alkanet with rouge, all the sources mentioned, that's mentioned many times. In this culture, it actually was not unusual for him to shave his beard and have a festival to mark the event. Other emperors who were in power at the time of their first being able to grow a beard did something similar. So that's not unusual. What is unusual, and the reason why it's written this way, is the contrast to, as soon as he had shaved his beard once, he then took to plucking all of the hairs to make himself look as feminine as possible. That's the part of the story that's unusual. And again, he referred to himself as a wife and as a queen rather than as a husband and a king in a relationship to this man, Hierocles, formerly a slave. So, at this point, how different is this from Nero? Is that what we're questioning? The extent to which we're talking about something goes beyond the limits of the tolerance demonstrated in the earlier reign of Nero. Quote, he wished to have the reputation of committing adultery, so that in this respect, too, he might imitate the most lewd women. It's a strangely phrased sentence, but the point is he wasn't ashamed to be known as having committed adultery. He wanted instead to be notorious for committing adultery. And we've heard words to that effect even in his heterosexual relationships with women before coming to the material we're dealing with now, the bisexual, gay, and transgender side of his life. He would often allow himself to be caught in the very act, in consequence of which he used to be violently upbraided by his husband and beaten so that he had black eyes. His affection for this husband was no light inclination, but an ardent and firmly fixed passion. So much so that he not only did not become vexed at any such harsh treatment, but on the contrary, loved him more for it. So there are several different scenes described in the sources of his relationship with this man whom he called his husband. But touchingly at one point, a group of soldiers have a sort of intervention with Elagabalus, and they say to him, look, you have to straighten up and fly right. You have to start behaving like a proper emperor. And whether or not they were actually demanding that he live as if he were a heterosexual, we don't know. We don't know exactly what the soldiers' demands were. But it is most likely they were saying to him that they expected him to be more like his father, Caracalla, to be more of a leader of the army, more of a soldiering emperor in this respect. And very believably, the Emperor Elagabalus is described weeping, falling to the floor and saying, please don't deprive me of this one man, his husband. Don't deprive me of this one relationship. You can take away everything else, but this relationship he can't give up. Although he promises he'll be good and he'll stop having so many other relationships. Some words to this effect. It's a very human side of his life. And this is his life between the ages of 14 and 20, roughly, that we're talking about. So Elagabalus, here referred to as the false Antoninus. Elagabalus married Cornelia Paula in order, as he said, that he might sooner become a father, he who could not even be a man. Afterwards, he divorced Paula on the grounds that she had some blemish on her body, and cohabited with Aquila Severa, whereby most flagrantly violating the law, for she was consecrated to Vesta, and yet he most impiously defiled her. Indeed, he had the boldness to say, quote, I did it in order that godlike children might spring from me, and from her, the high priestess. So close quote. On the one hand, it's easy to impute a sort of insincere motive here, that he's simultaneously trying to be ultra-effeminate and ultra-masculine. He wants to be more womanly than all the women. You're going to hear more about that in just a moment. But he also wants to be more manly than other men. He's overcompensating, one might say, in his relations with women for his relations with men, and his own tendency to at least engage in cross-dressing, if not transgenderism as we now understand it. Right. But the other motivation here that I think is sincere is that he really is trying to produce a new syncretistic religion, that he is really trying to permanently alter the course and destiny of Rome. And maybe it wasn't the brightest idea. I don't know if he was 15 years old or 16 years old when he had this idea. Maybe he was all of 17 years old. But as quite a young man, he had the idea that the way to reconcile the Romans to the new religion, this new religion of Elagabalus, which is so similar to First Temple Judaism, was to have a sort of magical marriage between himself as high priest and the woman as high priestess, so on and so forth. That, to me, has a certain ring of historical authenticity to it. And if it is madness, it is a kind of madness common to religious maniacs, gay or straight. Quote, he would go to the taverns by night wearing a wig, and there ply the trade of a female huckster, meaning a female prostitute. He frequented the notorious brothels, drove out the prostitutes, and played the prostitute himself. Finally, he set aside a room in the palace and there committed his indecencies, always standing nude at the door of the room, as harlots do, while in a soft and melting voice he solicited the passers-by. There were, of course, men who had been specifically instructed to play their part, for as in other matters, so in this business too, he had numerous agents who sought out those who could best please him by their foulness. He would collect money from his patrons and give himself airs over his gains. He would also dispute with his associates in this shameful occupation, claiming that he had more lovers than they, and that he took in more money. So, our sources, however biased they may be, contain the dead serious claim that his mother was a prostitute, despite being a wealthy and powerful woman, and that he prostituted himself as a kind of recreation, despite being the wealthiest and most powerful person in the known world at that time. So I think you can imagine the type of person who gets a PhD in classics, who chooses to devote their life to the study of ancient Latin. They are uniquely ill-prepared to deal with this kind of textual tradition. They're uncomfortable reading it. They're uncomfortable thinking about it. They very rapidly want to retreat behind the notion that all of this is just ridiculous rumor and exaggeration and can't possibly be true. Well, it can. I mean, it really just depends on what sort of road you've walked in life. Way back when I was employed at a nonfiction publisher in Thailand, I was involved with writing and editing and publishing of several books dealing with the politics of prostitution. I did research that was ultimately related to the HIV/AIDS epidemic about prostitution in Cambodia. But anyway, I read a great deal of kind of political science studies, hard social science studies of the reality of prostitution in Thailand, Laos, and Cambodia in those years. I have known face-to-face several women who had a history of prostituting themselves. Each of those women, when I knew them, had respectable jobs, respectable positions in life. And after they got to know me to some extent, they told me about the history they had of this kind. I have never paid to have sex with anyone. I've never been involved in a prostitution style of relationship. I'm not justifying something out of my own life here. But, there was a time when the advocates of gay rights said to the world, look, you have friends who are gay. You just don't know it yet because they're not openly gay. You have coworkers who are gay. You just don't know it yet. You may have uncles and aunts and, there may be people within your own family. You've known them all your life. and they haven't admitted to you yet. Well, prostitution, I think similarly, this is something that involves far, far more people in our society than we're currently comfortable admitting to ourselves. And this is one of just many difficult to deal with issues raised in the strange history of Elagabalus. Is it hard for me to believe that a young man with so much wealth and power would employ spies to find other men with enormous genitals, to employ people to seek out for him handsome men with large penises so that he could sleep with them? Is that hard for you to believe? Really? I mean, it really just depends on what kind of background you have in life and the type of person who devoted themselves to studying ancient Latin and got a PhD in this area. They may find this unbelievable. The sex life of Elagabalus, for me, is not really so surprising and shocking. The surprise and shock and the aspect of his life that raises serious questions is his religious career and his effect on the religion of Europe forever after. And I think there's a subsidiary but significant question of how was this interpreted by the historians who we're relying on? The written accounts that provide us with everything we know. There's a significant passage here from Herodian. What I'm about to read you is a paragraph being spoken aloud by the emperor Macrinus. So Macrinus is emperor for just about 1 year, as I recall, for a very short time. And he is the man who assassinated the alleged father of Elagabalus. He then took over command of the empire from Caracalla. Soon enough, he will be killed by the soldiers serving Elagabalus. We described that scenario at the very beginning of the podcast. This bizarre situation where Elagabalus' mother and even more his grandmother are conspiring to make him the emperor of Rome, and it's a conspiracy that succeeds. Anyway, so I'm going to read you this paragraph. This is Herodian supposedly quoting a speech given by the emperor Macrinus to the Senate, and he is justifying taking over command of the government after killing the former emperor. Quote, "Under my rule, all men shall live in peace, and senatorial rule shall replace autocracy. But let no one think me unworthy of my post, and let no one believe that fortune blundered in raising me to this position, even though I am of the equestrian order. For what advantage is there in nobility of birth, unless it be combined with a beneficent and kindly nature? The gifts of fortune fall upon the undeserving also, but it is the excellence of his own soul which brings every man his measure of personal glory." Pause. These historians, certainly Herodian, certainly Cassius Dio, they are struggling with the question of what makes a good man, and then what makes a good leader, and what makes a political system work. It is perhaps too much to say what makes a good political system, because I think all of these men are far too cynical and far too traumatized by their direct experience in politics to even really think about or talk about a good political system. They're writing just one list of unbelievable tortures, executions, backstabbings. They are aware that they live in a world in which whoever is willing to kill his own brother becomes emperor. Murder, fratricide, parricide, merciless internecine violence of this kind. That is what determines who will be the next emperor. The authors of these histories, certainly Herodias and Cassius Dio, they know it. And they are struggling with it. They are not giving you some kind of definitive answer to these questions. I think they haven't come to any clear set of answers themselves. I set aside the question, actually, of what the author of the Historia Augusta really has to say on this more philosophical question. Probably that would require another much longer podcast. Nobility of birth, wealth, and the like are presumed to bring happiness. But since they are bestowed by someone else, they deserve no praise. What, may I ask, did the noble birth of Commodus profit you? Or the fact that Caracalla inherited the throne from his father? Indeed, having received the empire as legal heirs, the two youths abused their high office and conducted themselves insolently, as if the empire were their own personal possession by right of inheritance. Just think about the absurdity of the questions being raised here. And this is really the preamble to the disastrous reign of Elagabalus, because this is the emperor immediately prior to Elagabalus, who rules for such a short time, who is replaced by Elagabalus. He is setting out the rationalization for his own position of political power, but instead of being a coherent or believable rationalization, it's drawing our attention to how irrational, how impossible to justify the reality of Roman imperial rule is. That it doesn't make sense. So here he's questioning that these other men, including Caracalla, whom he's just killed, they behaved as if the empire were their own personal possession by right of inheritance. Isn't it? Is that not the case? What are we fighting all these civil wars for? Is it not the case that you live in a monarchy, that in fact this is very much about rule of one man by right of inheritance? And if not, I hate to say it, Macrinus, but who elected you? Right? So there's a profound debate here about the nature of the Roman Empire, about what it means to be an emperor, what it means to be a king, and how we distinguish good from bad. And in some ways, I think these authors are just struggling with it, that they don't have all the answers themselves. But of course, they're also struggling against censorship. They're struggling against the possibility that they will themselves be tortured or killed, or their books will be burned, if what they say can be interpreted as criticizing or condemning the current emperor at the time of authorship. But those who receive the empire from your hands, so those who receive the empire from the Senate, those who receive the empire from your hands are eternally in your debt for the favor, and they undertake to repay those who have done them previous good services. The noble ancestry of the highborn emperors leads them to commit insolent acts out of contempt for their subjects. Sorry, I'm laughing because Macrinus is the only emperor who is not highborn. So he's saying the noble ancestry of all the other emperors before myself. But perhaps he's envisioning a future in which he's the beginning of a new period in which anyone can be emperor. You don't have to be born the son of an emperor. You don't have to be born with particularly noble or aristocratic blood. The noble ancestry of the highborn emperors leads them to commit insolent acts out of contempt for their subjects, whom they regard as far below them. By contrast, those who come to their throne as the result of temperate behavior, that's how we got to the throne, was through temperate behavior, treat the post with respect, since they secured it by toil. They continue to show to those who were formerly their superiors the same deference and esteem they were accustomed to show. So everything you have just heard in justifying the rule of one emperor, right? It seems almost like a parody or an indictment of any possible justification that could be offered for the rule of Emperor Elagabalus, which is to follow. And you may add, it seems like a parody or an indictment of the rule of any emperor whatsoever in general. This is a condemnation of the whole institution. The most unbelievable thing about Elagabalus was that he was able to take over and transform the religion of Rome. From Herodian, quote, "These boys," meaning Elagabalus and his cousin, who would later be emperor after himself, "these boys who were reared by their mothers and their grandmothers were at that time about 14 and 10 years old, respectively. They were priests of the sun god, whom their countrymen worship under the Phoenician name Elagabalus. A huge temple was erected to this god, lavishly decorated with gold, silver, and costly gems. Not only is this god worshipped by the natives, but all the neighboring rulers and kings sent generous and expensive gifts to him each year. No statue made by man in the likeness of this god stands in its temple, unlike Greek and Roman temples. The temple does, however, contain a huge black stone with a pointed end and a round base in the shape of a cone. The Phoenicians solemnly maintain that the stone came down from Zeus. Pointing out certain small figures in relief, they assert that it is an unwrought image of the sun, for naturally this is what they wish to see. Close quote. Herodian is the only source that describes this magical black rock that all of the scholars agree is a meteorite. If you're unaware, still today, the Muslim religion, the Islamic faith, is very centrally built around the worship of meteorites, these magical rocks that fell from the sky that had quite an inspiring effect on people in the ancient world who would see a bright light in the sky and then go out and find this strange black stone in the middle of a crater. Well, some of those strange black stones ended up housed within a special temple in Mecca in Saudi Arabia, a special temple that's called the Kaaba. Quoting Cassius Dio, Elagabalus danced around the altars to music played on every kind of instrument. Women from his own country accompanied him in these dances, carrying cymbals and drums as they circled the altars. The entire Senate and all the knights stood watching, like spectators at the theater. The spices and entrails of the sacrificial animals were not carried by servants or men of low birth. Rather, they were borne along in gold vessels, held on high by the praetorian prefects, and the most important magistrates, who wore long-sleeved robes with a broad purple stripe in the center, robes which hung to their feet in the Phoenician style. Close quote. It is impossible to exaggerate how influential this period of 4 years would have been. A period of 4 years in which every member of the Senate in Rome was forced to participate in what had been foreign and exotic religious rituals again and again and again. The impact of this exotic religion from the East, which would neither be the first nor the last, being promoted by the wealthiest and most politically powerful person in the empire. Setting aside all the details of his bizarre sex life, setting aside the extent to which people in the 21st century are still struggling to disregard historical facts and claim that this all must be fiction, this all must be rumor, innuendo, or, as I quoted at the beginning of this podcast, a farrago of cheap pornography. This can't be true. This can't be real. The interpreters still say can't cope with what we have written down about Elagabalus and his teenage sexuality. Right? More important and more mystifying by far is the extent to which we are looking at Christianity 1.0. We are looking at the first transformation of the Roman Empire from being a polytheistic, pagan, genuinely Greco-Roman or Greco-Latin religious tradition to instead being ruled by a strange, foreign, Semitic, monotheistic god. In Cambodia, a poverty-stricken, powerless, unimportant place, in just 4 years, the Khmer Rouge, the communist regime, changed the fate of the world forever. In Rome, in a position of unbelievable wealth, power, and influence. In 4 years, the regime of Elagabalus would, in its way, change the fate of Europe, change the fate of the world. It would prefigure and lay the groundwork for the Dark Ages that were to come.
Doomed Republic, that's the name of the podcast. Active research and informed opinion, that's the motto for a whole long list of podcasts, each and every one of which on different topics has my voice as the host. You can find me on Instagram. You can support me on Patreon. Don't act like it's hard to find me. And don't act like it's hard to find the link from this podcast to the others in the series. ARNIO, active research, baby.